Hey, what's up? This is Pete, and welcome back to another episode of Underdog Garage. Today, we are starting a mini-series on fixing the chassis rail rust on our 2003 Mazda MX5 Miata. This can be a big problem for these second-generation Miatas. Basically, the frame rails inside the engine bay start to rot out and act as a moisture trap. I didn't notice this when I first got the car because I bought it online at auction. So when the car arrived and I saw this, I was really intimidated by it, and I wasn't really sure where to go with it. After doing some research, I decided I was going to tackle this job, and I was fortunate enough to link up with a restoration shop in England called the Welding Corner. I spoke with the owner, and he sold me a set of patch panels that slip right in where the original frame goes. I'll get into more details about this patch panel, as well as some of the key measurements I took at the end of this video, but I just wanted to make sure I gave a quick shout out to the Welding Corner for not only sourcing these panels for me, but also answering all the questions I had. If you want to check out their site and learn more, you can visit the link to their site below, as well as a link to their Facebook page. I found this job to be actually easier than the rocker panel replacement, but it was a lot more intimidating at first. Also, because I had the engine out of the car already, this gave me a lot more access to the frame rail and a lot more room to work. But I've heard that you can do this job with the engine still in the car. With all that said, let's go ahead and get into part one, where we cut out the original rusted chassis rail. One of the big problems on these MX-5s, if they are not taken care of, is chassis rail rust. The inside of the rail is double plated, and that creates a perfect moisture trap to cause corrosion. I sketch out the chassis rail and I start taking measurements. I want to measure the vertical and horizontal position of each bolt hole relative to somewhere I am not cutting. This will help me ensure I have accurate placement of the new panel, both inside the wheel well and inside the engine bay. Once I've marked my cut line and I've gotten all measurements of bolt positions on the chassis rail, I start cutting out the metal. If you're doing this yourself, I strongly recommend wearing a full face shield, a dust mask, hearing protection, and gloves while cutting this out. Lots of rust pieces and metal shavings are thrown around in a tight space close to your face, so it can be very, very dangerous. I undercut the line that I marked so I have material to grind back if needed for fitment later. Then I start cutting inside the engine bay. At the AC condenser bracket, I cut down an angle around it, and then I cut down the underside of the chassis rail towards the front of the vehicle. Once I established my cut lines, I went back and kept hacking at any sections of the chassis rail I missed. Every time I was cutting and there was a point where I couldn't see any sparks, that indicated to me just how much rot and corrosion there was on the inside that I didn't even really see. And finally, the piece was removed. All right, so our chassis rail is now out of the car. It's really eye-opening to see just how much damage was caused by the corrosion. So now I'll get into the patch panel and again, some of the key measurements I took. So the patch panel from the Welding Corner is a single piece of metal. It's about 2 millimeters thickness, 14 gauge. It's actually thicker than the original factory metal. All of the hardware mounts on the new patch panel are pretty much the same, and these are interchangeable whether you have a left-hand or a right-hand drive. These will work for both sides. If you're reusing the original sway bar mounts, you'll have to remove the 4 bolts. There's 2 on each side of each rail, and on each rail there's 2 spot welds, one on either side. So now let's get into the measurements. The first measurements I'll show you are the measurements I took in the wheel arch. I measured the horizontal measurements from the bracket where the strut sits because I knew I wouldn't be cutting back that far. And I measured the vertical measurements from the top of the frame rail, knowing that I wouldn't be cutting that high and that would be an accurate position for the new patch panel when I installed it. For the engine bay, the horizontal measurements I took from the front cross member, and then the vertical measurements I took from the top of the rail. The big thing to keep in mind though is depending on where you're measuring from, your measurements might be different. As long as you use the same reference point when you're measuring, it's somewhere where you're not going to be cutting. As long as you use that point, and then when you go to reinstall and you measure from that point and everything is accurate, then you should be fine. One thing I wanted to point out, you may have noticed that in front of the AC condenser bracket in one of the photos, there is a big corrosion spot and a lot of the metal is rotted away. That was a specific area I had to address as well. I actually had to cut that AC bracket out, which would give me access to then put in a patch piece right there. And then I welded the AC bracket back into place there. That was something I'll be addressing in the next part of the series, but I wanted to just point it out in case you were just looking at it like, why is that big ass hole there? Like, are you doing anything about that? One part of this job I didn't capture was removing the subframe. To remove the subframe, you have to remove the struts, and then you have to remove 4 nuts, 2 on either side, where the front of the K-member mounts to the chassis rails. In the back, there are 4 bolts, 2 on each side, that mount the back of the K-member into the unibody structure. So once you remove all of those, then you can lower the subframe away, and then you have plenty of access to work on the rail itself. All right, that just about does it for this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We really appreciate it. Make sure you like this video and subscribe so you don't miss part 2, where we install the new frame rail for our MX5 Miata. If you have any questions, thoughts, or comments, make sure to leave them down below, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.